with less pain than ever before. The economy grows and the pie widens for everyone. And intuitively, that's because humans are by nature curious. We are ingenious. We strive to find and solve problems. That is in our DNA, which means in time, there is a trend towards human goodness. That doesn't just mean you get technologies that save people's lives, that make people live better and happier lives. It also means there's a trend toward progressive politics, towards welfare, towards caring about one another, towards democratic governance. Every instance of injustice is met in return with fierce pushback and protest. The death of Mahsa Amini was not met with silence, but with protest. The killing of George Floyd was met with outright outrage, which means the worst elements of society gradually become better over time, and the worst suffering than ever before. The economy grows and the pie widens for everyone. Intuitively, that's because humans are by nature outrage, which means the worst elements of society gradually cope with suffering. Given that opening government is right, that suffering is all around us and ever present, that means we biologically are hardwired to block out the worst memories of trauma. We develop coping mechanisms to deal with bad thoughts and difficult pains. We become gradually desensitized to the worst elements of our life precisely because we detest the feeling of pain. But furthermore, the evolutionary path humans followed was one in which suffering was a signal for people to avoid that activity, which means the nature of humankind trends away from the worst and most painful sorts of activities and towards those in which we find meaning. But even in instances of pain, the net outcome is almost always net happiness, because even in difficult moments, we often better appreciate the good we have in our lives, even when pain seems all-encompassing in the status quo. We cope with our pain and find ways to deal with it as others around us encourage us to deal with that trauma and process our experiences. And the vast majority of people empirically find meaning in coping with suffering. The fact that you make sacrifices like having to work late at night to feed your children is something people take pride in. And the vast majority of people care very deeply about their ability to provide for themselves and for others, an evolutionary instinct we all have. The meaningful bottom point to this claim is that the average human life is good, and opening government robs people of the tremendous amounts of joy in human life. How does OG respond? One, they say hedonic treadmill. First, the vast majority of people engage in non-competitive sources of joy because you can still have children, you can marry the love of your life, you can engage in religious services, which are not zero-sum in the way a debate competition is. But more importantly, people self-select into activities, into passions, into hobbies, which bring them meaning, and hence they continue to find value in those things. But additionally, human life is diverse by nature. Very few people live their lives monotonously. We interact with different people, engage in different activities, eat different kinds of food. And the differing elements of those activities are where we find meaning, especially at different points in our lives. That becomes normalized and you know to cope with it. But more importantly, uncertainty is a utilitarian good, not only because the hedonic treadmill claim goes out the window given that uncertainty, but also because the diversity of experiences provides us with the rich meaning in life. Finally, they say death is a concern. The vast majority of people, 85%, are religious and develop coping mechanisms to deal with that. And most people have an ingrained positivity bias to believe they will go to heaven, which means the vast majority of people find meaning in the prospect of their life, and in many cases plan with other people around them about what happens after their life ends. The end point is opening government's analysis is insufficient. People, if given the choice, would prefer to live. Opening government commits an active moral wrong by condemning all of humankind at the behest of a philosopher's principle to death. Second claim on morality. A few different principles to run here. First, on agency. Opening government is right. Children never consented to be born, but they also didn't consent to not be born. And the decision to not have children is a choice in and of itself, and hence carries moral weight. The problem, of course, is that we have no idea what non-existence looks like. And for all we know, non-existence could literally be hell. The question then becomes, how can we best maximize autonomy for individuals? And birth is utility and agency maximizing, giving people the option to live, to walk through the world, to make choices in their daily lives, maximizes people's agency. Non-existence by nature condemns you to a fate of no choice, of no autonomy. It's by giving birth and raising children that we better understand that you can have some level of utility and you are able to access the meaningful joys of agency. But furthermore, human existence is a moral good unto itself, not just a utilitarian good. We all know that we'll die, but we still care about things like, for example, furthering the pursuit of truth, thinking, reading, and writing, pondering and wondering about the world. We care deeply about the pursuit of truth and morality simply for the ends of those activities unto themselves. Wiping out human existence may be a utilitarian good, but it erases the moral goodness humans provide to the world. Before I move on, CG.
If you are a psychopath and you are consciously self-aware that you have violent tendencies and that you are like to hurt other people, don't you have a moral obligation to lock yourself away as to not hurt other people?
I'll deal with the claim on utilitarian harms to other in a moment. In terms of harms to other human beings, the vast majority of people self-select into relationships in which they are relatively positive to others at risk of being cut out elsewise. But more importantly, the claim on the environment simply doesn't work. Why is that? The vast majority of problems like climate change are problems we've already embedded into the structure of nature, of the wilderness. We've already set off a chain of events that is already in action. The only way then to stop the affliction of pain on animals is to create innovative technologies to deal with those problems like carbon capture. Ending human existence is simply an easier way out that doesn't meaningfully make the world better off. Finally, there are other moral obligations we have, in particular to those who are presently alive, to whom we know we have legitimate moral claims given their present life. But on their side of the house, they face a literal hellscape. Economically, the entire economy crumbles as people gradually die and those in old age lack care. The true growth of innovation is sidelined on opening government, and you get a crushing sense of hopelessness knowing you will literally be the last person alive, and you often feel a deep moral harm of having violated your religious obligations and your obligations towards your ancestors to procreate and have children. For all these reasons, life is beautiful. Opening government robs that. We oppose.
Thank the speaker for the fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to begin the case for proposition side.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'll start by having some extraneous rebuttal and defending our case. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, so their main pushback to our case is, but all of these 5 mechanisms aren't true because like empirically we can see that vast majority of people don't, opt out of life, and therefore this means that life is necessarily net positive and stuff like this. I would like to posit that this is not something that is necessarily true. The fact that people stay alive doesn't mean that it is utile for them to stay alive. So what I'm trying to say is that you do not have a viable option to opt out from life. And there are 5 reasons for this. Firstly, because humans, in order to survive, are biologically hardwired to prioritize their own, survival at the expense of everything else. This is why people who are massively depressed, who are, who hate their lives absolutely, who just wish to be gone forever, they have, in the moment when they try to opt out of life, their body starts to fight it against their own human cognition, which means that your body is fighting, against, you opting out of life and stuff like this. The second, so it's like your biology doesn't allow it to you. This is why vast majority of these cases, like in America, for example, happens with a gun, because you don't have to think about it. It's just a split second and stuff like this. The second thing is that it's physically painful. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into this, but it's physically painful and you do not want to go through this. Thirdly, there are societal narratives that are against this and that are saying that this is something that you should not be doing, that this is selfish towards your friends and your family and stuff like this. Fourthly, vast majority of people are religious and they deeply believe that if they do this to themselves, they're going to go to hell and stuff like this, which means that therefore, even if there is, so they presume that it is consensual because you are able to opt out of this because you have viable options. But as long as you don't have a viable and meaningful opt-out mechanisms, it is not consensual. It is not consensual thing and stuff like this. Secondly, I would like to posit that vast majority of their case is just mitigation to us. They say, you have coping mechanisms. But I would like to posit that this is something that is strengthening this analysis, because this is exactly what we proved to you. You are not happy. You are not content. Your life boils down to you trying to endure every single day, trying to endure by thinking about that Friday night that you are going to go drinks with your friends, and then you go back to your, sad life and all these sorts of things, and you're just waiting for these couple of moments of happiness and stuff like this. Just because you are not, opting out from life doesn't mean that you are happy, doesn't mean that you are not depressed, doesn't mean that you are not, experiencing this utility on day-to-day basis and and all these sorts of things. Secondly, there is indication of is that we do know that existence is inherently suffering and that existence is inherently disutile as per the mechanisms that Tin talks to you about, which means that while we do have reasons to believe that life is something that is here, should act on what we know and what we can reasonably assume, and that is that life is inherently suffering. Secondly, what they say is that, but world over time is becoming better. There are multiple responses to this. Firstly, notice that this is not engaging with a lot of things mechanisms, because we tell you that a lot of things, like you may have perfect socioeconomic status, but your psychology and your existence in and of itself is something that, stops you from being happy and all these sorts of things. Like you can be the richest person in the world, but you are still going to have this hedonic treadmill mechanism and you are not going to be happy and all these sorts of things, which means that this is not engaging with bulk of our case. But secondly, I would like to posit that just because life is getting better on net, like we are reducing poverty and stuff like this is not viable, because on your side of the house, still massive amounts of people are born in poverty. Massive amounts of people are born as, women and like minorities and all these sorts of things who are, have very bad lives still and stuff like this. So why would you, just because some of them aren't going to experience this because we are getting more progressive, doesn't mean that there is not going to be huge scale of them that are going to be experiencing, the suffering and all these sorts of things. But thirdly, I would also like to talk more about why life going, backwards. We are not going to become more progressive and stuff like this. We are going backward. And the reason for this is that there is scarcity of resources in the world. The world is created in such way that you are only able, for example, that there is scarcity of resources, which means that in order to improve your life, you have to take it away from someone else. For example, if I'm applying for a job, I might be happy if I get this job, but this is at the expense of someone else who is going to be sad because they did not get this job. And this is how, life is orchestrated, basically, that, a vast majority of people are trying to hoard as much resources onto themselves so they are able to, improve their lives. Well, this comes at the expense of other people who are suffering. This is why we are extracting minerals from developing countries and causing them a lot of, suffering and a lot of environmental damage. These people are suffering, not being able to capitalize off of it. This is why we are engaging in wars over oil, because, this is something that that is expensive. This is why, capitalists are exploiting child labor in order to be able to maximize their profit and all these sorts of things. I do not believe that these people have good lives. Before I talk more about ecosystem and women, I'm closing. No engagement. Okay, so what I want to say is that, first of all, about ecosystem. So basically what happened. So if you notice what happened when there was COVID and everything closed off and a lot of ecosystems started repairing just by humans not interacting with nature so much, because the way that humanity functions is that we have to destroy nature in order to make life good for us. We have to ship things and cause CO2 emissions. We have to mine things in order to get rare earth minerals in order to, have cars and all these sorts of things. This is why once humanity is gone, then ecosystems are able to repair themselves and all these sorts of things. And this is something that is vastly important, because these beings, like this squirrel in the field, like this cow that you are going to eat tomorrow, all these sorts of things, they might as well have cognition. But what they do have is they have pain receptors. They do understand the suffering. They do have a will to live. Like they want to live. They are fighting against, dying and all these sorts of things, which means that they are not inherently more morally valuable than humans are. And on the scale of the harm, there is more of these systems than there is of humans. And this is why we ought to prioritize them on the magnitude and the scale of impact. And we also don't believe that they're engaging about women who are suffering right now. And for all of these reasons, vote for us.
I'd like to have the speaker for the very fine speech, and now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for opposition side.
Hi, can you hear me? Be wise in the chat or suicide and suicide more broadly. Key things in this speech. First, the value of every single life in the future. Second, the effects on the ecosystem. And third, the effects on people alive today. Opening government's claim is that existence is pain. Their first reason for this is the hedonic treadmill, which is people face diminishing returns when they get used to their happiness. I have a number of responses to this claim. The first is that people get used to their suffering as well. This is because people alter their expectations for how much suffering they experience in life. The hedonic treadmill also applies the other way. And evolution wires us to get used to suffering. The reason why is the initial experience of suffering gives you information value. It tells you there is a threat to your life. But after that, you cannot be numbed by the suffering. You require the capacity to respond to that threat. What that means is people who, in the words of DPM, are biologically hardwired to prioritize their survival also learn to numb out experiences of trauma. The second response I want to make, though, is you do not get used to happiness, and this is asymmetric compared to suffering. Why is this true? The first is happiness is a lot more diversified. The mechanism for the hedonic treadmill is repetition, but most suffering feels similar. Whether it's psychological trauma or the physical pain of feeling burns, of feeling injuries, suffering feels the same because it triggers the same parts of the brain. But we experience happiness as people from a broad range of different things in different ways. Whether it's the short-term pleasure of food or an orgasm, or the long-term sustained joy that you get from forming relationships with someone, whether it's the repetitive joy of doing something like experiencing a sunset. Critically, people have agency and control over their lives. They have incentives to try to remember the happiness and tell themselves to not get used to it. These are not just exogenous forces outside the control of how people rationalize their own experiences. But third of all, there's an evolutionary incentive to not get used to happiness, because happiness is the motivator to do things, whether to nourish yourself or to reproduce, creating an evolutionary incentive to not get used to it. But third, their claim on uncertainty flips the mechanism for a hedonic treadmill, because if there's uncertainty in life, there's also uncertainty about the possibility of joy. Your life is not a monotony when you face uncertainty. So a lot of people approach uncertainty with massive degrees of positivity and joy. Their second claim is the majority of people are born into situations where poverty due to zero-sum scarcity resources. I have two problems with this. The first is happiness is not zero-sum, even if resources are. This is because people find joy in communities. Someone having a job means your friend having a job, means your partner having a job, means someone in your community having a job because maybe they share that cash with you. But second, even a system like capitalism is based on the capacity to do things like build innovation. It is a system of setting up incentives to do things for others. Like the incentive to make profits is the incentive to give services to other individuals to be part of an interconnected social system. But also reject that bizarre Malthusian claim. The population has tripled over many years, but all claims of starvation was simply false. The historical record literally proves their claim wrong. But let's say you buy none of this material. There are 3 deadlock breakers that show that the joy in life is substantially more important. Deadlock breaker number 1. People want to avoid suffering and so set up systems to limit suffering in their lives. So they set up healthcare centers. They invent new kinds of painkillers. They make ways to make their lives more joyful and less suffering. Deadlock breaker number 2. Outlets are becoming more and more accessible. There's an urge to not take one's own life. Societies wish to end their own lives. That creates political capital to set up systems of euthanasia and assisted suicide that become normalized in people's eyes. This means there is an opt-out compared to their world, but there's no opt-out because you don't exist and therefore have no agency whatsoever to opt out of your non-existence. Deadlock breaker number 3. Even if your life is suffering, you can pursue meaning outside of just your hedonic experiences. The most critical of these is faith. The vast majority of people are religious and find hope in the possibility that they will go to heaven. And that floods their emotions with things like serotonin, that floods their brain beyond just the neurotic experience of happiness and suffering because it gives them hope for the future. And this is more important because their side locks people into non-consent. This outweighs any material about whether the world is getting better or not, whether extinction happens or not. Because every generation of life is generations of joy, there's generations of pleasure, there's generations of people setting systems up for themselves to enjoy their lives and find meaning in their lives. This is the right that future generations are owed. Critically, it is also a right that comes from the fact that your forefathers, your ancestors died for you. You owe them an obligation that even if they can't experience, most of us have an intuition that there are real obligations to the dead that we should care about. Second, let's talk about the ecosystem and animal. Assume non-human lives matter. I want to flip their claim. Most wild animals, which are far larger in number than farmed animals, live awful lives. The structural reason for this is small wild animals follow a reproductive strategy that involves each of them having thousands of offspring with very little care, and the vast majority of them, as a consequence, end up dying, as this is the most efficient use of resources. As a consequence, what habitat destruction does is it reduces the scale of this suffering. It reduces the number of tadpoles that come into existence, the number of insects that have to live lives of suffering. This suffering is far greater than any potential suffering on a factory farm, especially given pressure from things like animal advocates to try to rectify things like suffering in factory farms in the future. This does not exist in the wild. But we also explain in Ryan's speech that problems like climate change have already happened. We've already subjected the forest and nature with these problems, and we owe them an obligation to fix them. We have some chance of getting carbon capture, sequestration, geoengineering technology on our side. That chance goes away in Gov's world. Thirdly and finally, on people who are alive today. Past their reductionist argument on pregnancy, because the experiences of billions of people around the world are genuinely deep joy, as well as technologies developing like IVF. I want to be clear that people who are alive today are people you have special relationships with and therefore an obligation to. Here's the problem. On their side of the house, their lives become substantially worse. All Tin says is we all want to live our lives happily, so we'll find a way to use resources. Here's the problem. As people age, they need hope for a legacy in the future. They need support in their old age that they don't have a younger generation for. They don't have the capacity to form relationships like the joy of childhood. They enter fewer human relationships that are often motivated by wanting to have kids. And they slow the process of economic growth, because true growth emerges from innovation. And innovation depends on having more people. Do not buy the Malthusian claims that more people means less resources. More people is positive sum. It means more resources and more joy for the vast majority of people. If you take nothing else from the speech, take this away. People have ways to process their lives as experiencing joy, regardless of the reductionist biological experience of happiness and suffering. And that processing power is taken away on Gov. Please oppose.
That is a further fine speech, and minor speakers to take POIs as required to do based off the World Manual. That being said, I'd like to call upon the member of government now to continue the case for the proposition side. Here.
Multiple, right?
Here. Yeah.
Yeah, just starting in a second. Before my speech, guys, have some empathy. This is the third time in a row I'm extending TIN, like 3 consecutive times. My mental health is on the brink. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Contrary to what opening opposition is saying, climate destruction right now is only the beginning. It is inherent within humans, and we're going to substantially prove it, to consume and to destroy the natural environment, and this directly trades off with the lives of animals that have equal moral worth. The trade-off is in 3 ways. The first of which, the more we consume, the more animals we kill. We basically kill sharks for their fins, we kill boars for their meat, we can kill snakes for their skins. Secondly, we have to destroy more more land, more forests, more jungles, to make more room for corporations, for roads, for agricultural farms. And thirdly, the more we consume, the more we pollute, the more the environment grows hotter, the more it fluctuates, the more animals are unable to adapt. Dolphins and sharks are literally boiling right now. Chimpanzees are fucking dying because there's erosion of the soil, meaning there is a direct trade-off between us consuming, us existing, and actively hurting animals. Why do we consume? Why do we will never stop? Why cannot we fix this, contrary to what opening opposition is saying? First, on the issue of consumption, 5 reasons as to why we consume. The first of which, they cannot run away from this. To meet our basic needs, we must consume, we must produce continuously over and over again. And even if resources cannot deplete themselves and regenerate, we pollute more on net. This is inherent within our existence. And notice, it's gonna only get worse. The current population boom is currently happening. We're currently at 7 billion, we're going to get to 10 billion down the line. So this is an inherent part. Secondly, we have a primal desire to consume as much as possible. We care about survival and ensuring our protection. Thus, we must consume as much as possible to take as many resources as possible, to have as many properties as possible to ensure our survival, the survival of our friends, relatives, etc. Thirdly, in many cases, our culture glorifies consumption. It is associated with social status. The more material that you have, materials and possessions that you have, the happier you supposedly are. It's a hedonic treadmill in which we find short-term gratification and a fix to our structural problems through consumption. Fourthly, the economy itself coerces us to consume. There are fast payday loans and convenient paying loaning apps that encourage us to consume because it brings more benefits. Their entire marketing and advertising industries that encourage us to consume, even when we don't want to consume, because it gives them more benefits. Because the more we consume, the more we buy, the more profits that they get. But fifthly, there are political incentives as to why we consume. Because the more the economy grows, the better your electoral chances are, because you're producing more jobs, because supposedly people have more things, because it's the current dominant norm. The GDP line must go up and up and up. It must never go down because we get taken out of office. This is inherent in the human condition. The only pushback that we get is that there are for us to resolve. I want to make it very clear. Maybe in the future, in 300 years, we can resolve it. We only have to prove that it's not likely for us to resolve it prior to reaching a tipping point that destroys the planet. This is the only thing that we have to prove. Why is this structurally true? The first reason is that there exists a massive collective action problem that prevents cooperation. It's not only exists on a purely country-to-country level, in which many countries are in different power blocks, in which to subjugate and dominate the other, basically China and Russia versus the European Union and America. Secondly, they have existing ethnical and historical conflicts, which makes cooperation much less likely, for example, Pakistan or India. Or thirdly, a purely economical benefit. If you voluntarily decide to transition towards green energy, you are certain to accrue an economical harm relative to other companies in countries. If you don't know whether they're going to act upon that, this creates a prisoner's dilemma, in which if it's uncertain, you wish to go for the certain benefits of consuming more, not transitioning, and being the last one to transition to get a relative economical advantage relative to them. This is why transition is not likely to happen, or it's not likely to happen sufficiently quickly. And this is why companies are massively lobbying the governments to actively ensure that regulation is not happening or is happening as slowly as possible. The second reason is that a green transition may happen, but if we reach it, we'll already be at a tipping point. That is to say, even if it happens in 100 years, the green transition would require a significant amount of resources. Silver, like lithium, we basically have to use our existing industry to create the technologies. The third reason is that countries and companies have incentives to transition, but first to squeeze as much as possible value out of every single oil and resource that they have. That is to say, Saudi Arabia may transition in 120 years fully, but until then, they're going to take every single opportunity to pump as much as possible into the atmosphere. The only solution for us is not to produce, because companies cannot use the oil if there are no consumers, if the total amount of people buying the end product is getting lower and lower. This is the only way for us to save animals. Now, two additional burdens, because it's a messy debate. Firstly, why do animals have moral worth that is equal? Two reasons as to why this is the case. The first of which is that we believe that what is morality is protecting people from harm, that is to say, protecting creatures from harm, physical and mental, irrespective of their inherent status. This is why we care for babies, even though babies don't have self-awareness and consciousness. Or we care about people in comas, even though they may be permanently impaired and they don't have consciousness, but nevertheless, they're equal moral actors. Secondly, we care about allowing the expression of preference of a creature, irrespective of whether they have intelligence behind it. It's fair for us to allow an animal to escape from a cage because it simply wants to have freedom, irrespective of whether there's an intelligent intention behind it. Before I continue, opening.
Life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. I explained why animals in the wilderness live lives of much deeper suffering than anything humans can endure for them. Habitat destruction liberates them from...
I'll get to that in a second. Before that, why do we have a moral obligation to save them? We are consciously aware what we are doing to the environment. We're consciously aware that our consumption, our very existence, actively hurts and destroys animals every single day. In much the same way, it is more insignificant to us for us to jump in a pool to save a child. It doesn't cost us that much. The motion doesn't cost us for us to suicide just to not to take an action. It's morally obligatory for us to prevent a moral evil in which we are saving those animals. Finally, why is a life in nature comparatively better? One reason behind this, you are better able to adapt, even if there is a doesn't change. Comparatively, human pollution or active human violence against the environment not only makes the environment slightly suboptimal, it destroys them altogether. That is to say, the margin and intensity of the harm is much larger on their side. Maria is going to explain further. On all those grounds, propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the member of opposition to continue the case to the opposition side.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yep.
Wonderful. I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It would be morally reprehensible and illegitimate to abandon a world we've ruined. I'm going to very quickly go over what we owe the natural world, and I'm going to talk about why us disappearing ensures the end of the natural world and thus is immoral. And I'm going to talk about what we actually owe animals to do, why it's likely that we actually take these actions, and then why we obviously don't fix this if we suicide as a people. And then if I have time, I'll do why we win, although that's really Naomi's job. Before that, a little bit of rebuttal. So we hear a lot of stuff around capitalism and kind of consumption from closing government. I want to try to take this out of the debate in 4 ways. 1, efficiency. What capitalism and in general our society prizes is efficiency in the use of resources in order to make things as cheap as possible and to demand the least resources possible. What this means is that all of the problems that they're talking about are self-fixing. We use less and less resources in order to create the same amount of things. We make sure that we create stuff that costs less and less resources, that demands less and less pain, demands less and less sharks. For example, once alternative protein is cheaper than real meat, we just won't eat eat real meat anymore because we would never ever do that because it is cheaper not to. And so we think these problems will solve themselves. Secondly, we have a strong incentive to innovate, right? This is exactly the way that people are rewarded for finding these things. And so we have a strong economic incentive to innovate and actually solve a lot of the problems they're talking about. Carbon sequestration, prevent the environment falling apart, deal with our habitat. Thirdly, we have strong changing norms that probably deal with this problem. We see that people care very deeply about circular economy. We see that people are willing to change the way they live their life and buy different kinds of cars. We see that they are willing to sacrifice significant portions. The kinds of journeys they take. There's a reason that plane companies say how much CO2 they demand, because this matters to people, and people have changed the way they behave because they know that they are going to die if they don't. If we just commit suicide, we don't care anymore, and we are likely to very much use all of the resources we have left. They never give any reasons why we won't. Everything they talk about will get so much worse when we're suiciding as a people because we are not going to take any of the consequences of this, and so we are likely to go over the tipping point. Finally, I also just think we can fix a lot of these problems. We see the unique human ability to fix the environment, and I'm going to be talking about that more in my point. So, CG obviously agree with us that we care about animals. I'll just note that OG do as well when they talk about the reparatory things that we have with the harm that we've caused, the lack of epistemic access or full knowledge of their consciousness, and the huge number of animals, which means that this causes enormous amounts of damage when we hurt them, which is all the reasons Tim gave. So now let's talk about why disappearing ensures the end of the natural world or very much harms it and so is immoral. 1, let's talk about climate change. I think that it's pretty clear that we're either literally past the tipping point or right at the tipping point, and the bits where we commit suicide are places where we will use a lot of the natural resources and so cause further damage to the climate, likely causing the end of it. What this means is that all the animals that exist, all the billions upon billions, we're talking about over 100 billion chicks a year, we're talking about trillions of fish, we're talking about hundreds of trillions of insects, will all die. And we think that it is already a huge moral harm. Secondly, animals that we have bred themselves cannot survive without us. We're talking about hundreds of billions of chicks that die every year and billions of cattle and pigs, and we think that we owe to them specifically. Why? Because we are the ones who created them. We are the ones who bred them for these kinds of things so that they cannot survive in the wild and they are divorced from their previous habitats. We are the ones who raised them in these areas. We are the ones who know best how they can actually be helped. And that means that we're making sure that they will be able to survive. Making sure they will be able to take care of them is a unique moral burden that we carry. Thirdly, natural habitats have been ruined, right? The Amazon lots of it has been set on fire. forests that we've planted have been made of all the same trees. So when there's a disease, all the forests will die and all the animals within it will die. The Sahara and the desertification we're causing has meant that there is less and less habitats for natural animals. The acidification of the oceans is killing off fish and is likely to end up causing a mass extinction event. These are not naturally reversible because animals cannot control or adjust their environment. And because we destroyed and caused, and because we specifically destroyed the natural phenomena that would normally fix it by making sure that certain kinds of animals go extinct, and so the things that they would eat that would prevent the acidification of the ocean don't exist anymore, or by intervening and causing things to go past the tipping points they cannot be reproduced. What does this mean? This means, one, we owe an attempt to prevent even if we fail. Notice, even if we don't succeed in reversing anything, as a people, we have a moral duty not to commit suicide in order to try and reverse the damage that we've done. Number two, we actually can help, and it's very likely. What kind of help can we do? One, active interventions like we do today, reforestation, specific kinds of carbon capture, ocean cooling and cleaning and deacidification through the insertion of specific kinds of sieves that take out all the plastic in the ocean, through the release of specific kinds of animals that will reorganize the oceans and eat the what do they call so the weeds that grow in oceans that we eat in sushi, and through the research and the innovation that we have into ways to reverse these things, and through our ability to actually improve the lives of animals, right? We, beyond everything we've talked about so far, in a world where we actually reach our full potential and drastically change the way the world looks, we can give animals medical care. We can give them shelter. We can give them safety. We can grow food organically and feed it to them so that they don't need to attack each other or eat each other anymore. We can provide them with natural habitats where they can roam. All of this with a literal heaven for animals, which would create a huge amount of benefit, even if we never get any of it. I'm going to explain now why we are likely to actually take these actions and win this debate already. Before I do that, I'll take OG.
Guys, nature has its organic reparatory and carbon capture mechanism. This is literally why carbon offsetting works by planting trees. But habitat expansion is the prerequisite for that work. We need a place for these trees to grow.
And thank you so much. I've already explained why that doesn't happen. It's like saying, oh, the Sahara will refrost. No, the Sahara is growing because we have pushed it over the tin. Great. Why is it we like to take this action? One, the expanding circle. We understand that people beyond ourselves matter, and that beings beyond ourselves also have kinds of feelings that they have. We see this in the existence of things like the 5 freedoms, or like the 5 domains, where we demand that animals that we slaughter, right, which today would be by government's logic, something we don't care about at all, be slaughtered in specific kinds of ways, and we see as we're making them more and more stringent. Secondly, research. We are constantly advancing and understanding what animal conscious means and what it looks like, and this means that in the very near future, we are going to be able to convince people that these things do actually have feeling. And this is the kind of conversation we're having right now, and we can see how this is percolating throughout the levels of society and convincing people that animals do actually matter. Thirdly, empathy and connection. Notice that you have pets and that you have this desire for people not to suffer. And this means that you can actually see that animals are suffering. Now, this is important because today, most of the time, we don't actually suffer from much hunger. So we are no longer desensitized to violence. And that means that when you show people chicks being murdered, they don't know how to deal with that shit, because that is something that they no longer have in their life. And that causes a visceral reaction that is wrong. And we can see that with the growing numbers of vegans in Europe and the US. We think that we're not going to fix this if we suicide because we're not going to be around and thus we can't improve their lives. Naomi will explain why we win. Thank you so much.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech and call upon the government to close the case for government bench. Here.
Hi, I presume you can hear me.
Yeah.
Amazing. If you guys in chat, I would take one from opening. I'll start in just a second. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. If you didn't know, Tin's speech is a copy-paste of his speech in Doc's semifinals 2 or 1 year ago, right? If you know, you know. The reason why I say this is because the lesson is simple. The problem with running 4 arguments is that you cannot prove each one of them fully. What suffers in Tin's case is exclusivity, meaning if he doesn't prove why climate change doesn't have any other solvency, aka making it better for animals in any other way, this argument false. Biser uniquely proves to you why it is within human nature to constantly consume and why you cannot fix this in the long run, even if you so wish so, as the hopeful CEO are here. Firstly, CEO, and then extensive playing with OG. I want to posit a few things. Sia says, but we have strong incentives to innovate. That's good and well. Let me respond to that. Few things on this. One, not even the solutions you want to propose, such as electric cars, green technology, pollute so fucking much. Meaning, the batteries and the uranium you need for electric cars and extraction of it causes a lot of harm to the animals within those within those habitats. Producing the factories that make those cars take out the landscapes of those animals. This means that the harm you do is not it's proportional to the benefit you do. Therefore, you don't inflict any positive material on that. Secondly, it's just a huge trade-off that people don't support. You having to destroy the fuel and energy sector, or you having to take away people's jobs is something that is hugely unpopular. And even if they have the best incentives to go fucking vegan, they're not willing to lose their jobs or to be disqualified for that. Thirdly, though, by the time you're able to do this to a grand scale that it has an impact, it's already caused a lot more harm that is accumulated that is not justified. Meaning, by the time by 100 years you do this successfully that is able to do on a grand scale because it's so fucking expensive to do, by that time the moral harm, it has been done. Now, I would say, even if you have some mitigations towards this, I don't think it's justified for the majority of the cases because you still need to inflict a lot of harm that we prove that people do not change. They don't explain why people are able to overcome their human nature to destroy and to take away from others. They just explain why a competitive analysis, why some people might be good. And I would posit those people are the most privileged people who can afford to buy bio meat, who are able to afford clothes that are not made of animal skin. All of those things are unproven, therefore fall out of the debate. But secondly, on the questions on whether or not animals will live better lives afterwards, and if they say, but we've passed the tipping point, therefore it doesn't matter already. I will make it in very, very simple terms like a villager. Having a 0.5% Celsius of temperature in the atmosphere rising up, compared to 3% Celsius of degrees is comparatively worse. And we prove why this happens overall. So even if you pass some point of no return, even though they assert this, it's comparatively worse on their side, at least even in the best case that you do certain stuff. We prove why if you as humans cease to exist, you are able to, those species are able to regenerate again. Plants and species are able to overcome again. The mixture of species is able to happen naturally in the way that they were intended. Now, moving on to all, I would posit a few things. Firstly, they say that we should value future lives because those people who could experience the benefits of life. I would posit two things. One, if they were correct, abortions should be legal because we deprive babies of having the good things in life because they would all have the opportunities to live, but we don't because we value people's lives right now. And do you know what's the flip here? Is that every single additional life that comes on planet Earth harms directly another person's life. This is the same with abortion, right? When a baby is born, maybe he can live good, but the mother suffers. This intuition applies because once more people come to exist, they consume more, they require more resources, they are actively controlling and eating more animals, meaning you inflict a lot more harm on the people who live right now, which is something that is a direct harm upon them. But secondly, I would say that generally, they say you're able to control your life in a good way, right? To remove the pains that you have. I would say this is literally 10% of the population who are privileged enough to have the ability to do that. Putting mental barriers to suffering is people are able to do that when they have a therapist, when they have the time to go to therapy, all of those things. Therefore, it's not something that majority of people are able to do, and they don't prove why the majority of people who are in developing the world, who are suffering every day, are able to do that. But secondly, they say, but the habitat's destruction liberates those animals. Why is this untrue? One, most animals are not carnivores. They eat on plants, they eat other stuff. That does not mean that they need to kill other animals. Secondly, they adapt to the environment changes because they're created to do that. Because over time, the selection process happens, and whoever is able to survive survives. Thirdly, the moment that you are able to live in your environment means you don't fear every day that you get caught and put in a fucking zoo. And lastly, you're able to have the liberty as an animal to choose where you live, what you do, not to be scared every day that humans may capture you. Now, I would posit then, before that, before I engage.
Trillions of frogs and fish die painfully within minutes of birth and have no chance to adapt because evolution's strategy for them is to involve men offspring with lethal parenting. That's evolution's strategy.
No. Doesn't matter. They will die on both sides. Even if humans help some animals exist, they will die with them when you stop regenerating them and like producing them. Even we have to make a trade-off that certain humans suffer. Why are we okay with this? One, there is a direct harm compared to the indirect harm. You indirectly harm people when they just die out naturally. You don't kill them, you don't deprive them of the ability to live. Maybe some future people do, but you don't know why. You kill animals and then cause a direct harm on them every single day. But secondly, the means of protection. Humans can adapt and make their lives a bit better, but animals have no choice to do so. Lastly, comparing with OG, I already pointed out that this analysis is very vulnerable to the odd bench's criticism, which is to say, climate change has other solvencies, or that you are able to invent other things that you do not need to prevent, or that animals would be better. This uniquely proves to you why this is unique. What's then the most important thing within the OG case? One, it's not situational analysis, it applies to everyone. The moment that climate change gets worse, it happens to everyone. People get bronchitis and they can breathe normally. They get diseases that they need to pay money to solve. But secondly, it creates constant pain as opposed to situational pain when you lose a tournament, right? Because you can't breathe normally, because you eat polluted food and you drink worse water. But secondly, if creatures are of equal moral worth, this always in itself outweighs this first argument that people don't consent. Now, the takeaway here is simple. Maybe they bring out a lot of arguments, but we bring the crucial link as to why there is no other alternatives. This is the only way we have to do. Very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to close the case for opposition bench, and indeed the debate as a whole.
I presume you can hear me. Your voice exclusively in the chat. Housekeeping is done. Beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that we win this debate on OG and CG's metric, and I think that I'm going to explicitly and effectively weigh why animals are far more important than anything that we've heard from OO about human lives, and why we exclusively fulfill the burdens necessary to prove that we need to remain in order to save the animals and the rest of the living creatures on Earth, and fulfill that OO didn't, and therefore win that clash against them as well. Let's begin with some rebuttal to CO. And first, let's address all the sufferings that aren't due directly to climate change. I think that the vast majority of living creatures just never interact with humans and are caused no direct suffering whatsoever from the existence of humans. They are deep in the oceans where we never reach. The vast majority of living creatures are in the oceans, and we don't touch the vast majority of those areas. There are insects in areas that we don't interact with, and we don't go looking for insects, and that is most of the living creatures altogether. They are in forests and in areas that we don't enter into. The truth is, yes, we cause a lot of harm to living creatures, but it is a drop in the ocean compared to all the ones that we don't interact with directly. And so I think that it's far more important to talk about the ones that we are affecting indirectly through climate change and our effect on all habitats, even the ones that we don't go to or touch. And this is the acidification of the oceans, this is the warming of ocean temperatures and global temperatures and those effects. Insofar as those effects, when we have no future ourselves, it gets way worse. We consume way more. We take no responsibility. The drive to, we need to survive. We need to find a solution for the planet. Companies, we get that you're making a profit now off it, but in 50 years, that just won't be an option for you anymore because the resources will be gone and your children will be destroyed and all those things that now are convincing because it's your children that aren't going to be able to survive. All of that is gone because you have no kids. You're going home. So why not just drink all the booze before we leave and have as much fun as we can while we can? And I think that is when everything gets so is that on the side of governments, there is what we likely do, and as bad as it possibly can get. So it means that already it is guaranteed that government side is on the outcome probabilities worse than that of opposition. But also note that Yishai actually analyzes why it is likely that we do create a better future when humans are around. Because we have to save ourselves, we want to save the planet, and we are already working on it. And it's getting easier all the time. CG try to be dismissive with this, electric cars, but then you're still mining, you're still causing harm. Still causing harm to a far smaller area and far fewer animals than when you're destroying the entire planet. So still a benefit to the vast majority of living creatures on this earth. But also, this is just not the relevant technologies that we're talking about that Yishai applies. We're talking about things like carbon capture and actively removing the harm that we've created and taking the clock back and stopping this harm. We're talking about deacidification of the oceans and making them livable habitats again. We're talking about stopping the icebergs from melting so that we don't enter into this spiral where they melt, release more carbon into the earth, it warms more icebergs melt, and therefore there is no stopping it anymore because the earth is carbonizing itself and destroying itself. All of these things are tech that we are already working on and that we are capable of making breakthroughs in. We are making enormous breakthroughs in these things. But at the moment there is no reason to invest them in anymore is the point where we stop trying and we stop investing in them and they do not happen at all. We are capable of solving this problem, but only if we have skin in the game and bother to invest in it. Now, lastly on this statement of, half a degree compared to 3 degrees isn't comparatively worse. I think that there is no such thing as comparatively worse when the comparative is the planet is no longer livable, right? If it is no longer livable, I don't think the creatures not living here care that it was a bit warmer or a bit colder. I think that what matters here is whether we reach that point of no return where it is not livable and where we can save it. And we only avoid that spiral if we continue trying. Before I continue, can I take closing?
It's certain that when you buy a dress, you kill an animal. It's not certain that you're going to innovate or whether innovation is going to help animals comparatively more than the certain harm that you're occurring upon them.
But it is equally certain that if you are never going to have a child and you don't care about the future of the planet, you probably buy more dresses, you probably don't bother to try to save any animals, and you probably don't bother to do any good. And then it is guaranteed that all of those creatures die out and they have no future on the planet. This idea of, we have to consume, I accept that we consume, I accept that causes harm. It is just a lesser harm and therefore I care about it significantly less, not to mention it is constantly being reduced by improvements through technology. I think very obviously that we beat OG on their explicitly stated priority of animals that are more of the creatures and that are suffering and have no way of protecting themselves or defending themselves. What is their response? The world will mend itself. Natural carbon capture is not fast enough, won't happen soon enough, and won't be able to keep up with us continuing to pump the air with even more carbon as we stop taking responsibility. It is very, very obvious that most of the harms that are occurring to the planet at this point are not naturally reversible anymore, and that the only way to solve them is by our intervention. And I don't think that we see the analysis as to why the world mends itself beyond a sort of kumbaya Mother Earth knows best. I think that Yishai analyzes why these problems have reached a point where they are only worsening themselves unless we intervene and fix them. Lastly, against OO. I think that first off, animals and plants for that matter that may well be suffering and experiencing pain as well are far more important than humans. They are far greater in number and therefore we weigh their suffering and the things that are going to happen to them far more. But also I think the thing that is analyzed for humans because they are going to have to go through a painful attempt to continue surviving against the odds and against an environment that is killing them. And they're going to be forcibly killed without any choice, as opposed to humanity just choosing to not have children. So this harm is a lot worse. We think also that they aren't suffering in the comparative where they continue to live. Most pains of life are due to cognition, as OG analyzed, and animals, for the vast majority of time, are not suffering and are very adaptable to their environment and aren't suffering from their environment and simply continuing to survive and fulfill their biological needs of reproducing that they're pretty good at doing and effective at doing, and so are living as far we know very well. Why we think we do a lot more than OO's throwaway lines. We show that we have to fix the problem because it will not fix itself and there is no other way of reversing it, beating governments. We show that we can fix it and it is the probable situation because we show that we will fix it, but only if we choose to.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their very fine speech and everyone for the fabulous. It's very